Yo, Jay here, aka Felid, here to introduce BEATSURFING's plugin Random Metal. Now this isn't going to be a tutorial, I'm not going into all of the nooks and crannies of the plugin, but hopefully by the end of this you'll be able to understand how to start making the sounds that you want, or even better, finding new sounds that you didn't think were possible. So let's start at the top here. First things first, you got your settings up here. That's always good to know. Secondly, you've got your presets here. You can use BEATSURFING's presets and they're amazing, especially for finding specific sounds, or you can go ahead and save your own when you're ready to. Just press save, type whatever you want, confirm, and you're done. Now for the creative stuff. Up here you have your matter. When you click on this, this will open up, I think it's 45 different matters that you can use. Now not all of them use a different engine underneath, but you can see the ones that use the same engine because they're named the same way. For example, ferrithium, ferritite, ferritidin, and ferritate all use the same engine, the same synthesizer underneath, but they just give you slightly different tones and textures. You can cycle through them all using these arrows here, or you can click on this to kind of go into the more itemized list. Now before we go further, I'm going to open up this advanced panel down here. We'll get into that in a bit, but for now we'll move from left to right. On the left hand side you have your global parameters. So everything that you do here will affect everything else in the plugin. We'll go into how that works a little bit further on, but the first and possibly biggest feature is this big randomize wheel here. I'll just play one note for the sake of exploring this. This deviance factor says how much you're going to randomize everything. So if it's right down here, the randomization will be very subtle and not much will happen. If it's all the way up here, you'll get completely different tones and textures. Ready? Now you can always go and undo the randomization that you just did by using that button right there, or redo just like any other redo does. Next we have the bleed. Now for each different matter, this bleed button does something different, so it's best to just dive in and explore exactly what it does to that sound specifically. Nice. Next you have your global pitch, and this will affect the pitch of all of these pads, which we will get into in a second. But right now, just understand that changing this changes the whole plugin's pitch. Now you can fine tune this by holding shift. You can see down here exactly how much is changing. And that's an endless scroll, so when you reach the bottom of your screen, it'll keep jumping back up so you can keep going. That's a nice touch. Next you have your bend sensitivity. This is if you're using pitch bend in any way, either on a MIDI controller or on your keyboard. This allows you to define how much that pitch bend is going to actually change the pitch. So you can set it between 1 semitone or 7 semitones. Next you have this stretch. Now, it's tempting to think of this as a release on an envelope, but it's not. It's actually changing the core sound that you're going to be playing. So let me show you. Right down here, very short sound. As we move up, you hear that tail elongate, and that's not just opening up the sound that was underneath, it's literally creating a longer one. And last but not least, in this section you have your gain, which obviously affects the amplitude across the board, but you also have your velocity sensitivity. So if this is all the way down here, then you're going to be playing at the same velocity no matter how hard you hit your keys, or no matter what velocity your keyboard is set to. But as you push it up, you'll be able to play softer notes and have them represented more authentically within the plugin itself. And next we move over here. Now this, I love it. I don't know if you can tell. I'm excited. This XY pad affects everything. I'll just show you. Now that's actually changing the neural network patterns at the core of the plugin. So everything that you do here will affect everything that's happening underneath everywhere else. I hope that makes sense. Now let's move over to the pads over here. Essentially what those are 12 different instances of this matter. Preset with different neural patterns, but they're essentially 12 different instances of this matter. Now the best thing about this is that each of these pads has its own set of parameters on the right hand side here. That means that you can affect each of them in a different way, which is great when it comes to performance. Alternatively, if you find a set pad that you like the sound of, you can put it into key tracking mode, and that does what it says on the box. Now with some of the matters, that's really cool because you can literally play kicks down the bottom end and hi-hats at the top end and everything in between. Nice. Now let's move over to this randomize button here. This doesn't change anything about the core matter. Everything will stay the same apart from these parameters on the right hand side for that specific pad. And again, just as this deviance slider up here, this deviance slider allocates how much of that change you want to happen. So if I have it down here, not much is going to change. If I have it up here, a lot's going to change. Now this undo button does work across the board as well. So if I change something over here or randomize here, I can undo it by pressing that button. It's not just for the randomize. Now something very interesting that was pointed out to me is that if you turn this deviance right down and press this randomize button, the parameters on the right hand side aren't going to be touched by this one. So this will only be affecting the core engine, but these parameters will stay the exact same. Whereas if you put the deviance up over here, these parameters are going to change as well. Now let's dive into the right hand side and go from top to bottom. This impact affects the attack, aka the transient of the sound that you're playing. This decay determines how much of that sound you're going to let through. And the curve determines at what point that decay comes into effect. So it pulls down the tail end of that sound. Or, alternatively, opens it up so you can hear everything. Nice. It's important to remember that this decay works alongside and on top of this stretch. So I can stretch a sound and decay it down, or let it run. Now remember that these parameters only work for the pad that you have selected here. So this pitch knob is only going to affect this one pad, none of the others. And this shift knob is essentially a frequency shifter, although in some instances it can affect only part of the engine or different elements of the engine. Same as this bleed effect has an alternating processor, which is exciting to explore as well. Now, amongst all of the other things that we can pick from and change, each of these matters has 4 different variations built in already, and you can choose. And that just provides a little extra tonal and textural differentiation. Now, this color slider is something that, again, matter dependent, changes the color and the texture of the existing matter. Whereas this color down here affects the color of the effect being added to the matter. And again, that is matter dependent. So this plugin is all about exploration. Now the effect is given depending on the texture and the tone of the matter. It's just been determined to be the best effect for that matter. This slider isn't determining how much of that effect to add or not. It's determining the color of that effect. Now these 2 buttons here are your classic EQ, low end, high end. Now while it might sound complex, it's actually quite simple. It is quite literally affecting the EQ of the loudest parts of the sample at the top end and the EQ of the quietest parts of the sample at the bottom end. So imagine you have the loudest part of your hit. This will be affecting that. And imagine the tail end of a cymbal when it gets to the quieter parts. This is going to be affecting that. And so it behaves differently for each sound. That's very cool. Now this determines how much of the effect is being applied to the quieter parts. And this determines how much of the effect is being applied to the loud parts. And lastly, you have your classic pan, left to right, how stereo you want the sound. So if you want it mono, or if you want it stretched out left and right, and your gain for that particular pad. Now what I skipped out intentionally is this instability slider. I'll use this matter to demonstrate. When it's right down here, you're not going to be able to hear that much difference between each hit. But as I slide it up, it'll start to sound a little more human, a little more variable. Subtle, but very effective, especially when you're playing a lot of notes at the same time. So that's it. First introduction to this plugin. There are so many possibilities. The coding underneath this thing is insane. So get it, play with it, experiment, see what you can come up with, share it with the BEATSURFING team. They love hearing about what people do with it, and let's go make some cool music.